Most of the officers now in the army had grown up under the Star of Victory. They shielded me, Genghis Khan had said. In snow and in rainy nights, as well as in battle, my descendants must cherish them as a monument of my making, and not offend them. A generation of victory had given the ranks unshakable confidence in their leaders. They believed that the spirit life of Genghis Khan had entered the standard of the army with its 9 white horsetails. To this confidence was added a sense of safety. The first rule of the army was to bring the ranks back alive. In proportion to the terrible loss of life they had caused, the Mongols had suffered very little. Officers had been trained to be jealous of the safety of their men. The ranks felt equally confident of the highest command. The mounted bowman in the foremost patrol knew that he was moving in accordance with a definite plan that would destroy the enemy by strategy rather than hand-to-hand fighting. The strategical skill of the Mongols had been developed in the stress of war. They had learned to keep track of an enemy's movements while trying to conceal their own. In this maneuvering, they had learned not to depend on commands given by voice, which often cannot be heard in the uproar of moving mounted men. Regiments signaled their movements by raising black or white ensigns, by raising and lowering colored lanterns at night. They used whistling arrows with a hollow, pierced head for other signals. They could hide at times their formation behind a drifting smoke screen. With the armed tumans advanced other branches of the service, interpreters to deal with the tangle of language, its Chinese physicians and Mongol shamans to minister after their fashion to the sick, and the Dorug Ashis, the road managers, who were to take inventories of the captured areas for the Great Khan at Karakorum. There was even an officer in charge of a lost and found department, and behind the army, cattlemen and carpenters worked to build the corrals and huts of the the stations of the horse post that was to link the New West to their homeland. This host of 100,000 men or so, it had not yet been reinforced by Batu's divisions on the Volga, was marching without maps or compasses or knowledge of what lay at the end of its road, to face many times its number of potential enemies scattered over hundreds of thousands of square miles. Yet it marched with implicit confidence, without thought of defeat. The mounted columns move at ease out of the plains, through the passes of the Altai and into the taiga, the dense forest growth of Ibir Sibir. Snow held the forest, but the stores and cattle awaited the tumans along the route. Detachments were thrown out to hunt for game, which grew scarcer as the forest changed to the fir and birch of the west. By now, all the different contingents of the right wing, the Barangar, were on the line of march. Some women rode with them in the ox-drawn kibitkas to cook the meat on the march, and to serve the men in the solitude of the Sibir, where no towns were seen. At times, in the camping places, they had theatricals to amuse them, actors in false beards, and the costumes of legendary kings singing the shrill chants that the tribesmen knew by heart. Threading through the low summits of the Urals, the columns began to descend into the western steppes. They crossed rivers on the ice, and the hunters went out to the flanks on skis that carried them swiftly over the deep snow. With the melting of the snow and the first grass, they came on lean horses to the concentration point near the Grey Volga. There they were met and expected by Subutai and the princes who had spent the winter in the yurts of Batu, methodically going over the reports of the merchants and spies who pieced together for them the picture of the western regions, its thoroughfares and grazing lands, and especially the defenses of its cities and politics of its princes. For you will not find one nation at peace with another, the spies announced, nor one chieftain who does not raid his cousins. Nay, even their archpriest is at war with their great emperor. Subbatai was insatiable in asking about the details of these quarrels. A master of strategy, he knew the importance of keeping an enemy divided, and the Russians. Batu, Khan of the Golden Horde, lived under a cloud. In a way, he had become an exile. He was a bastard son, and his father, Juchi, had felt the shame of being born of another father. In his latter years, Juchi had kept away from the other brothers in the western steppes, where some said that he meant to create a dominion of his own. Upon Batu, his son, this shame rested. Ogadai had granted him willingly enough the khanship of the forest people in the west, and he had given him a nominal command of the new expedition. Batu, who had kept to the nomad life of his father, had welcomed Subbatai and the imperial princes shyly. He had come on foot to greet his mighty guests, and had slaughtered cattle to feast them in his pavilion that shone with cloth of gold on the bank of the Volga, so that men called it the Sira Ordu, the Golden Horde. He was mild before his guests, uncertain of them when his impetuous cousins teased him. They laughed at him good-naturedly, although Kuyuk felt jealous because Batu held the higher command. Why, behold, they said, Batu is splendid. There is no prince anywhere so magnificent as he. This nickname stuck, and Batu became known among the Mongols as Sain Khan, the splendid Khan. Under his amiability, however, there was a stubborn pride. The son of a bastard, he could never reign as Khan. So not only do they punish the child for the crimes of do they hold back the child for the crimes of the parent, but the grandchildren, Still, he meant to hold power among them, especially the madcap sons of Chagatai. A contrast to their father marked Batu's good fortune. Baidar and Buri, a grandson, lived only to hunt and make war, and Kaidu, the fledgling of the lot, Ogadai's grandson, imitated them. Batu Sain Khan, he cried, is a good host. Why, he stuffs us robbers with his best meat. His manners are such that he will never be angered at us. Kaidu had caught Subbatai's eye. The aging master of war saw in the wild youngster the spark of the Mongol genius for warfare, and he instructed him patiently. The one thing Kaidu lacked was patience. Batu felt that he was beholden to Ogadai, who gave him the command of these great ones, yet he did not know how he was to make them obey him. He was anxious lest they try to take away his beloved grasslands. Fortunately, with Subbatai at his side, he had no need to fear them as yet. Subbatai did not hurry. He and his Mongols were amazed at the vast extent of the Russian plain and the richness of the grass. Wild grain sprang up miraculously from the black earth. Here was an ideal land for the horse nomads, and they understood why Juchi and Batu had clung persistently to these western steppes. And that early summer on the Volga, Subbatai did not move farther west. His first thought was to clear his flanks. At the same time, he welded together the tribal regiments that served Batu, the Bashkirs of the Turgai region and the Kyrgyz of Sibir, stiffening them with the steel of Mongol discipline. In doing so, he thrashed the Bulgars on the upper Volga, destroying their age-old trading center of Bulgar. To the south, he sent Mangu to break up the wild Kipchaks. Mangu and his men rode by the stone babas, the mark of another race, upon the steppes, indifferently. Oh, maybe not another race, maybe just another culture. By now, he and his Mongols were accustomed to meeting the images of strange entities. The Kipchaks gave way before him as foxes take shelter at the coming of a wolf. Some of the nomad Turkish tribesmen submitted to the Mongol yoke, but most of them fled westward toward the Dnieper. Mangu let them go and turned back to hunt down the bandits that had infested the lower Volga. Not until the first heavy snow covered the steppe did Subutai move against the Russians, for it was now a law laid down by Genghis Khan that the Mongol armies of invasion emerging from the steppes should advance by stages. When the conflict was ended in the first zone, the survivors that were rounded up with their horse herds, the men were conscripted and led or driven on by the Ordus into the next zone. Here the refugees were used as a human screen by the Mongols at need in an attack. By this, the lives of the Mongol contingents were protected. In the first zone at their rear, no mass of men remained to rise in rebellion. A few guard posts scattered along the roads could maintain order, aided by the terror of the invasion. In this way, Subutai herded the remnants of Bulgars and the Volga men into mounted bands, trained them, and led them into Russia. Before that, he sent envoys to demand submission from the Russian princes as the price of peace. The strange Mongol emissaries appearing at the gates of the towns were put to death by the Russians. As if enraged beyond caution by this, Subutai struck into the northwest, straight through toward the larger Russian cities. Apparently, he was doing a senseless thing, turning aside from the open steppes where the nomad raids had gone before into the forested regions, and he attacked as in December 1237, when the cold was bitter. Actually, the Mongol leaders had reasons of their own for doing this by striking their first blow against the stronger regions where the Russians might have defended themselves given time in the forest. The Mongols cleared this difficult ground of defenders before the Russians realized their purpose. The open steppes were a thoroughfare for the nomads. They let the south wait, and by moving in midwinter, they could cross rivers on the ice. The Russians would not expect them and would be collected with stores of grain and meat in towns. As for the forests, the Mongols cut a way through, wide enough for 3 carts to pass abreast at need. They advanced, the chroniclers said, as if driving game in a hunt. The Russians had settled down for the winter behind the wooden walls of their cities and hamlets. They were a turbulent, warlike people. Their princes, descendants of the Varyags, Swedes of the north, their cities of the fertile Ryazan region had thrived from the slave and fur trade, and they carried on unending feuds. Well, if you're attacking other groups, it's got to make its way home, right? Their log walls had been sufficient to check the raids of the Kipchaks, and Bulgars and the Slavs had the foolish hardihood of brave men who had never been far from home. They were warriors on horseback rather than horsemen. They rode in crude iron armor, followed by the mass of the Smerdi, the stinking ones, the Finns, and armed peasantry on foot. Heretofore they had fought hand to hand with swords, and they knew no other method of warfare. They had a warning of the Mongol peril when the army of the southern princes was annihilated by Subutai on a raid at the river Kalka in 1222. The warning went unheeded. An eclipse of the sun at the end of that summer caused them more concern. There was a sign in the sun on the 3rd day of August. The monks of Novgorod wrote in their chronicle, "The sign was of this kind. There was a darkness on the western side of the sun. It became like a moon of 5 nights." A comet? What was going on? Along the frozen rivers, the Mongol columns moved north, sending envoys ahead to bid the Russians submit to the Great Khan and pay a tithing. Well, volcanic event, maybe. They sent their emissaries, the Novgorod Chronicle relates, to the knyazes of Ryazan, a sorceress, and 2 men with her, demanding from them 1/10 of everything of men and knyazes and horses and everything, 1/10. And the knyazes, without letting them into their towns, went out to meet them, saying, "Only when none of us are left alive, then will all be yours." And the knyazes, the noble-born of Ryazan, sent to Yuri of Vladimir, asking for help, or himself to come. But Yuri neither went himself nor listened to the request of the knyazes of Ryazan, but he himself wished to make war separately. But it was too late to oppose the wrath of God. The Russian princes seemed incapable of understanding their danger, would not move to aid each other at first. When they did move sluggishly through the snow, they had no knowledge of what was going on elsewhere. The Mongol mounted divisions swept over them piecemeal. The wooden walls of Ryazan crumbled under the bombardment of the Mongol siege engines. Before the Russians realized that the walls had fallen, the Mongol horsemen were in the city. Ryazan became a slaughterhouse. Men were hunted through the red snow of the alleys and thrust on stakes to wriggle out their lives. Priests who had shut themselves up in the churches were exterminated like sheep. The women who had sought sanctuary with them were violated and killed. No eyes, a chronicler mourns, remained open to weep for the dead. In swift succession, Suzdal, Rostov, and Yaroslavl were stormed and destroyed. The Mongol columns followed the frozen rivers from citadel to citadel. Moscow, then a small town on the steep cliff, today the height of the Kremlin, where the Moskva River joins the Nenaya, was burned, and the men of Moscow, the Novgorod Chronicle explains, ran away, having seen nothing. Along the Kolomenka River, a Russian army suffered a bitter and violent death. Vladimir, the largest stronghold of fertile central Russia, was broken into, while its princely families were crowding into the church of the Holy Mother of God, as they so deemed it, barricading themselves in to gain time, to have themselves shorn like the monks and taken into the monastic order in these last moments of their lives, crowded into the sacristy of the church. They were burned. The Grand Prince Yuri, who should have rallied his vassals in time to meet the Mongols, was not even in the city. He was approaching when he heard that Vladimir had been destroyed, and Knyaz Yuri, the chronicler adds, sent out Doroza to scout with 3,000 men, and Doroza came running and said, "They have surrounded us, Knyaz," and the prince began to muster his forces about him, when behold, the Tartars came up suddenly, and the Knyaz, without having been able to do anything, fled. And it happened, when he reached the river Sit, they overtook him, and there he ended his life. This tale was repeated elsewhere. The feudal levies of the princes marching out of their log and dirt fortifications, moving slowly through the snow, were struck before they realized they were in danger by a firepower that crippled them from a distance. The Mongols divided into 2 columns and took cities, as it were, in their stride. Thus did God, by means of these men, the chronicle adds, take from us our strength and put into us perplexity and a dread as if of thunder. The Russians were valiant enough Their best men died. Surrounded, fighting hand to hand, the Mongols let the fugitives go, as their custom was, to be followed later through the forest paths, and eliminated or added to the growing bands of slaves. There was no escaping the swift-moving detachments. The heavy Russian horses were outpaced by the steppe-bred mustangs. In the month of February, 12 walled cities were obliterated. In the short space between December and the end of March, the free peoples of Central Russia vanished, and the sturdy and turbulent independence of the Varyag-governed Slavs ceased to be. The word Slav had meant glorious. Now the territory of the Slavs became a vast prison zone, and it was destined to be that for a long time to come. Another change took place. The destruction of the city communities drove the survivors out into the smaller rural hamlets, where they turned by necessity to agriculture to sustain their lives. The animal-like Smarties raised food for the children of the slain warriors. Well, humans are animals, thank you very much. The snow was melting, and the spring rains setting in when Batu's column moved north through the pine and birch woodlands toward the Baltic and Novgorod the Great.